The Great Lakes, Part 1.
Table of Contents: The Great Lakes.
The Great Lakes, America's inland sea. The 5 Great Lakes bordering the United States and Canada have served as an important waterway for commerce and trade from the earliest days of the French explorers and voyageurs up to the present day of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Learn about how these lakes were formed during the Ice Ages, and how they are now being threatened by pollution and the invasion by new species of marine life. All about the Great Lakes, with visiting and touring information, geography, history, attractions, and other points of interest.
Dr. Sydney Soclof. drsydney22@gmail.com. 2023. Narration by Dr. Sydney Soclof,
Zoe Phonemes,
and Nathan Koltove. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tiny.1/ytnavigator. The Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are also called the greatest lakes and lakes of superlatives.
The Great Lakes are a chain of freshwater lakes located in eastern North America on the Canada-U.S. border.
The Great Lakes consist of Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. They are sometimes referred to as inland seas of Canada and the United States' third coast or north coast.
The Great Lakes form the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth,
holding nearly 20% of the world's supply of fresh water.
Here is a map of the Great Lakes region showing the states and provinces that border the Great Lakes. Note that Michigan borders 4 of the 5 lakes. The Canadian province of Ontario borders 4 of the lakes, with the exception being Lake Michigan. Ontario is the only Canadian province that borders the lakes.
4 of the 5 lakes form part of the Canada-United States border. The 5th, Lake Michigan, is contained entirely within the United States. The St. Lawrence River, which marks the same international border for a portion of its course, is the primary outlet of the lakes, and flows through Quebec to the Atlantic Ocean.
The Great Lakes region contains not only the 5 main lakes themselves, but also numerous minor lakes and rivers, as well as approximately 35,000 islands. We note again that Lake Superior is by far the largest lake in terms of both surface area and volume, as well as the deepest. Lake Erie is by far the shallowest lake.
We see that the level of the lakes gradually decreases from Lake Superior at 601 feet above sea level to Lake Erie at 569 feet. And then after Niagara Falls plummets to the level of Lake Ontario at 243 feet.
This compares the elevations, depths, and volume of the lakes.
Here is basic information on the Great Lakes. We see that Lake Superior is the biggest both in area as well as in water volume and depth by far.
Here is basic information on the Great Lakes, including major cities on the lakes.
These are the 10 largest lakes of the world. The Caspian Sea is called sea because the Romans, finding it is salty, named it Mare Caspium. Many geographers, however, consider it a lake because it is landlocked.
Although much smaller than Lake Superior in volume, Lake Baikal in Russia is the world's largest freshwater lake in terms of volume with 20% of Earth's surface fresh water.
The Great Lakes contain roughly 22% of the world's fresh surface water. This is enough water to cover the 48 contiguous U.S. states to a uniform depth of 9.5 feet, 2.9 meters. Although the lakes contain a large percentage of the world's fresh water, the Great Lakes make up only a tiny portion of America's drinking water, roughly 4.2%.
The combined surface area of the lakes is nearly the same size as the United Kingdom, and larger than the U.S. states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire combined.
The Great Lakes coast measures approximately 10,500 miles, 16,900 kilometers. However, the length of a coastline is impossible to measure exactly and is not a well-defined measure.
Lake Superior.
Here is Lake Superior.
Lake Superior is the world's largest freshwater lake by surface area, and is the world's third largest freshwater lake by volume. Lake Baikal in Russia is larger by volume, as is Lake Tanganyika. The Caspian Sea, while larger than Lake Superior in both surface area and volume, is brackish.
Lake Superior was named Le Lac Supérieur, or Higher Lake, in the 17th century by French explorers because it was located above Lake Huron.
1. Lake Superior is, by surface area, the world's largest freshwater lake. 2. The surface area of Lake Superior is greater than the combined areas of Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. 3. Lake Superior contains as much water as all the other Great Lakes combined, even throwing in 3 extra Lake Eries. Lake Superior is the largest of the Great Lakes in surface area and volume. Lake Superior could contain all the other Great Lakes, plus 3 more lakes the size of Lake Erie.
4. Lake Superior contains 10% of all the Earth's fresh surface water. 5. There is enough water in Lake Superior to flood all of North and South America to a depth of 1 foot. 6. The deepest point in Lake Superior is 1,300 feet. 400 meters, below the surface. 7. Over 300 streams and rivers empty into Lake Superior.
8. The average elevation of Lake Superior is about 602 feet above sea level. 9. The Lake Superior shoreline, if straightened out, could connect Duluth to the Bahamian Islands.
10. The average underwater visibility of Lake Superior is 27 feet, making it easily the cleanest and clearest of the Great Lakes. Underwater visibility in places reaches 100 feet.
Lake Superior has been described as the most oligotrophic lake in the world. The term oligotrophic is used to distinguish unproductive lakes, characterized by nutrient deficiency, from productive, eutrophic lakes, with an ample or excessive nutrient supply. Oligotrophic lakes are most common in cold regions underlain by resistant igneous rocks, especially granitic bedrock.
The lake is about 350 miles, 563 kilometers, in length and 160 miles, 257 kilometers, in width in the summer. The sun sets more than 35 minutes later on the western shore of Lake Superior than at its southeastern edge.
11. Lake Superior is one of the Earth's youngest major features. At only about 10,000 years of age, dating to the last glacial retreat. By comparison, the Earth's second largest lake, by surface area, and the largest by volume, Lake Baikal in Russia, is 25 million years old.
12. Lake Superior produces the greatest lake effect snows on Earth. Significant lake effect snows are a rare phenomenon, occurring, besides the Great Lakes, only on the east shore of Hudson Bay and the west coasts of 2 Japanese islands.
The average annual snowfall in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula exceeds 200 inches in places.
Lake Superior has been at its modern elevation for only about 2,000 years, when elevations of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron dropped, creating rapids at Sault Ste. Marie. Lake Superior has its origins in the North American mid-continent rift of 1.1 to 1.2 billion years ago, which produced a huge plume of hot mantle where the present lake sits. The crust tore apart, leaving an arch-shaped scar stretching from Kansas through Minnesota, then down to Michigan.
Within its borders, Lake Superior has the thickest and nearly thinnest crust found anywhere in North America.
When European explorers visited Lake Superior in the 1600s, they reported giant sturgeons, up to 9 feet in length, and pike of greater than 7 feet in length.
The average annual water temperature of Lake Superior is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. It only very rarely freezes over completely, and then usually just for hours.
Lake retention time is the amount of time taken for a substance introduced into a lake to flow out of it again. Lake retention time, also called the residence time of lake water, or the water age or flushing time, is a calculated quantity expressing the average time that water, or some dissolved substance, spends in a particular lake.
At its simplest, this figure is the result of dividing the lake volume by the flow in or out of the lake. The retention time is especially important where pollutants are concerned. Each year a small percentage of the lake's water flows out through the St. Mary's River, and it takes almost 2 centuries for the water to be replaced entirely. The retention time.
The Lake Superior drainage basin is rich in natural resources and scenic beauty. It is sparsely populated and economically dependent on its natural resources, which include metals, minerals, forests and recreation tourism opportunities,
such as national lakeshores and national, state, or provincial parks. It is particularly known for its clear, cold water and agate beaches.
Isle Royale in Lake Superior is the second largest island in the Great Lakes. Isle Royale is U.S. territory, even though it is closer to the Canadian coastline, and is part of Michigan, though it is much closer to Minnesota.
The highest point on Isle Royale is Mount Desert at 1,394 feet, 425 meters, or about 800 feet, 240 meters, above lake level.
Lake Michigan.
Lake Michigan is the third largest Great Lake by surface area and the 6th largest freshwater lake in the world. It is the only one of the Great Lakes located entirely within the United States.
Lake Michigan's cul-de-sac formation means that water entering the lake circulates slowly and remains for a long time, retention, before it leaves the basin through the Straits of Mackinac. The water retention time is 99 years. And second only to Lake Superior.
Many rivers and streams flow into Lake Michigan, and the major tributaries are the Fox Wolf, the Grand, and the Kalama. There is a diversion from the lake into the Mississippi River basin through the Illinois waterway at the Chicago River. The northern part of the Lake Michigan watershed is covered with forests, sparsely populated, and economically dependent on natural resources and tourism. In contrast, the southern portion is heavily populated with intensive industrial development and rich agricultural areas along the shore.
Lake Michigan beaches, especially those in Michigan and northern Indiana, are known for their beauty. The region is often referred to as the third coast of the United States after those of the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The world's largest freshwater dunes line the lake shore.
Millions of people annually visit the dunes and beaches at state and national parks and lake shores.
There are often high sand dunes, and the sand is soft and off-white, known as singing sands because of the squeaking noise caused by high quartz content, made when one walks across it.
The water is usually clear and cold, between 55 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 and 21 degrees Celsius, even in late summer. However, because prevailing westerly winds tend to move the surface water toward the east. Warmer water flows to the Michigan shore in the summer. Lake Michigan beaches in northern Michigan are the only place in the world, aside from a few inland lakes in that region, where one can find Petoskey stones, the state stone. Lake Huron.
Lake Huron is the second largest Great Lake by surface area and the fifth largest freshwater lake in the world. It is the longest shoreline of the Great Lakes, counting the shorelines of its 30,000 islands.
Lake Huron receives the flow from both Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, but water flows through Lake Huron, retention time, much more quickly than through either of them.
The Lake Huron Basin is heavily forested, sparsely populated, scenically beautiful, and economically dependent on its rich natural resources.
Lake Huron is separated from Lake Michigan, which lies at the same level, by the narrow Straits of Mackinac, making them geologically and hydrologically the same body of water, sometimes called Lake Michigan Huron.
Georgian Bay is a large bay located within Lake Huron, separated by the Bruce Peninsula and Manitoulin Island. It contains the majority of the islands of the Great Lakes, with a count of approximately 30,000.
Georgian Bay and Saginaw Bay are the two largest bays on the Great Lakes. Georgian Bay itself is large enough to be among the world's 20 largest lakes. Manitoulin Island is the largest freshwater island in the world.
Early explorers listed Georgian Bay as a separate sixth lake because it is nearly separated from the rest of Lake Huron by Manitoulin Island in the Bruce Peninsula.
Dispersed throughout the Great Lakes are approximately 35,000 islands, and the largest among them is Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron.
Manitoulin Island is the largest island in any inland body of water and home to the world's largest lake within a lake, Lake Manitou.
Lake Superior is slightly higher than both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. It drains into the St. Mary's River at Sault Ste. Marie, which then flows southward into Lake Huron.
The St. Clair River connects Lake Huron to Lake St. Clair, and the Detroit River connects Lake St. Clair to Lake Erie.
Lake St. Clair is the smallest lake in the Great Lake system, but due to its relatively small size, compared to the 5 Great Lakes, it is rarely, if ever, considered a Great Lake.
Lake Erie.
Lake Erie is the 11th largest lake in the world by surface area, and the 4th largest of the Great Lakes in surface area and the smallest by volume.
95% of Lake Erie's total inflow of water comes via the Detroit River water from all the upper Lakes Superior, Michigan and Huron, the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair and numerous tributaries. The rest comes from precipitation.
Because of the small volume of Lake Erie and the inflow of water from the upper lakes, the retention time of Lake Erie is the shortest of the lakes at 2.6 years.
Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes and is especially vulnerable to fluctuating water levels.
Wind setups, wind pushing the water from one end of the lake toward the other, usually from west to east, have produced large short-term differences in water levels at the eastern and western ends of the lake, the record being more than 16 feet, 5 meters.
Lake Erie is the warmest and most biologically productive of the Great Lakes.
Point Pelee National Park, the southernmost point of the Canadian mainland, is located on a peninsula extending into the lake.
Several islands are found in the western end of the lake. These belong to Ohio except for Pelee Island and 8 neighboring islands, which are part of Ontario.
More ships pass through Lake Erie in a 9-month season than through the Panama, Suez, Manchester, and Kiel canals put together. The main commodities shipped are bulk products, iron ore, grain and coal.
The Port of Cleveland is the third largest port on the Great Lakes. Generates over $350 million. And handles over 15 million tons of cargo.
The ship traffic in Lake Erie being the highest among the Great Lakes, along with it being the shallowest and roughest of the lakes, has led to it having the highest number of known shipwrecks in the Great Lakes.
The Battle of Lake Erie, sometimes called the Battle of Put-in Bay, was fought in September 1813 on Lake Erie off the coast of Ohio during the War of 1812.
9 vessels of the United States Navy defeated and captured 6 vessels of the British Royal Navy. It was one of the biggest naval battles of the War of 1812.
This shows the location of the Perry's Victory Memorial on Put-in Bay Island.
Lake Ontario.
Lake Ontario, the 14th largest lake in the world, is the smallest of the Great Lakes in surface area. Although it is smaller than Lake Erie, it holds 4 times as much water due to its much greater depth. The lake water retention time is 6 years as compared to 2.6 years for Lake Erie.
Lake Ontario lies 325 feet, 99 meters, below Lake Erie, at the base of Niagara Falls. The basin is largely rural, with many scenic resort areas. However, a few large urban areas, including Ontario's capital city of Toronto, are located on the Canadian shoreline.
The Niagara River, including Niagara Falls, connects Lake Erie to Lake Ontario.
This is the Niagara River and Rainbow Bridge.
The Niagara Falls was always an obstacle to navigation into the upper lakes until the Welland Canal was completed in 1829 and expanded ever since to allow ships to pass around this bottleneck.
The Great Lakes Waterway is a system of channels and canals that makes all of the Great Lakes accessible to ocean-going vessels. Its principal civil engineering components are the Welland Canal, bypassing Niagara Falls between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie,
and the Sioux Locks, bypassing the rapids of the St. Mary's River between Lake Superior and Lake Huron at Sault Ste. Marie. There are also maintained channels in the St. Clair River and Detroit River between Lake Huron and Lake Erie.
The St. Lawrence Seaway and Great Lakes Waterway are co-administered by Canada and the U.S. They opened the Great Lakes to ocean-going vessels. However, the move to wider ocean-going container ships, which do not fit through the locks on these routes, has limited shipping on the lakes.
The 2 waterways are often jointly referred to as the St. Lawrence Seaway. The Great Lakes Seaway has larger locks and deeper drafts than the St. Lawrence Seaway, with the result that a number of lake freighters are confined to the lakes, being small enough to operate on the waterway but too large to pass down the seaway.
We will next have a short video clip on the Welland Canal.
The best place to see the St. Lawrence Seaway system's network of locks in action is from the Welland Canal, the detour that enables ocean-going ships to get around Niagara Falls. Here, 8 locks lift and lower ships, a total of 326 feet. 3 of the locks are twinned to allow for two-way traffic. At Welland, the 46-foot difference in water levels from lock to lock is most dramatic. 3 of the locks, locks 4, 5, and 6, lie back to back to back. They form a unique stairway in the water, raising and lowering ships which are loaded with steel, iron ore, and other raw materials like bathtub ducks.
There's no other canal system that I know of in the world that in such a short space of time lifts ships such a great height. And it's something like 126 feet, those 3 locks that they assault the escarpment straight on.
Since all the new locks of the Seaway were set to the specs of Welland, work at Welland during the Seaway renovation was limited to deepening the canal from 25 feet to the new minimum standard of 27 feet. That involved a lot of dredging. 23 million yards worth of earth and rock were ultimately removed from the 27-mile-long canal. Beyond Welland lies Lake Erie and the rest of the Great Lakes system.
Lake Ontario's name is derived from Ontario, a Huron word meaning Great Lake.
The Canadian province of Ontario was later named after the lake.
The St. Lawrence River connects Lake Ontario to the Atlantic Ocean.
The St. Lawrence Seaway goes from Montreal to Lake Ontario at Kingston, Ontario.
Ice on the Great Lakes.
Despite their vast size, large sections of the Great Lakes freeze over in winter, interrupting most shipping. This is the Great Lakes ice coverage in the winter of 2003.
A United States Coast Guard icebreaker helps keep the passage open for much of the winter, although shipping usually ceases for 2 or 3 months each year.
From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico.
The Great Lakes are connected to the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Illinois River, from Chicago to the Mississippi to the Gulf, with heavy tug-in barge traffic.
This is the Illinois and Michigan Canal, connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River via the Illinois River.
The Illinois waterway connects Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River via the Illinois River.
Pleasure boats can also enter or exit the Great Lakes by way of the Erie Canal and Hudson River in New York. The Erie Canal connects to the Great Lakes at the east end of Lake Erie, at Buffalo, and at the south side of Lake Ontario at Oswego.
This again shows the Erie Canal and Oswego Canal.
History of the Great Lakes region.
The Great Lakes were formed by erosion and deposition during the repeated glacial advances and retreats of the most recent of the ice ages, which ended about 10,000 years ago.
Where did the Great Lakes come from?
The Great Lakes were formed at the end of the last ice age about 10,000 years ago, when the Great Laurentide ice sheet receded.
This was 21,000 years ago. The glaciers cover all of present-day Canada and part of the northern U.S. As the glaciers receded, they left behind meltwater which filled up the basins that the glaciers had carved, thus creating the Great Lakes as we know them today.
This is 14,000 years ago. The glacier meltwater is filling up the depressions that had been gouged out during the advance of the glacier.
Because of the uneven nature of glacier erosion, some higher hills became islands in the Great Lakes. This is 9,000 years ago. This is the situation about 8,400 years ago.
This was 7,000 years ago. Most of the lakes are now exposed. This is the situation about 5,700 years ago, where now only Greenland is permanently covered with ice.
This is 4,000 years ago. The glacier has retreated enough so that the drainage of the lakes through the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean is now possible.
We will next have a short video clip on the geology of the Great Lakes.
As a major geological feature of the landscape, the Great Lakes are very young. They have existed within their current coastlines for a mere 5,000 years. However, the land beneath them is ancient, formed by volcanic activity as much as 2 billion years ago. Known as the Canadian Shield, the granite formations today are the northern shores of Lake Superior and Lake Huron, and spread all the way to Hudson Bay to the north. Within the Canadian Shield, the depressions that are the Great Lakes began to develop about 600 million years ago, and the ocean covered the land for a few million years, laying down sediments that over time were compressed into limestone and shale. Later came the glaciers of the ice ages. There were many ice ages over the eons, and all of them captured and held fresh water which lowered the level of the sea. The evaporating seawater left behind massive salt deposits in the regions of the Great Lakes' southern shores, particularly in Michigan and Ohio. The last ice age, the one responsible for forming the 5 Great Lakes, began melting as recently as 13,500 years ago. Known as the Wisconsin Ice Sheet, the glacier extended as far south as a line drawn from present-day Chicago to New York City. The massive glacier was over 1.25 miles thick, and its sheer weight and forceful grinding movement scraped the limestone and shale back down to the bedrock of the Canadian Shield. The ice sheet literally clawed out the lake beds that would eventually fill with water when the ice melted.
Native Americans.
The Great Lakes region was home to numerous Native American groups who fished its waters and operated trade networks extending from present-day Minnesota to New York.
These included the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Algonquin, Erie, Iroquois, Huron, Sac-Sac, Fox, Winnebago, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi.
We will next have some short video clips on Native Americans of the Great Lakes region.
As a whole, the Great Lakes present two very opposite faces when their impacts on the Native American cultures of the region are considered. On one hand, the Great Lakes were a natural barrier that helped to separate the two main tribes of the region. And on the other, they were a waterway that made travel and trade among tribes easy and convenient. Tribes that lived along the northern shores of the lakes spoke the Algonquin language. Along with the Algonquins themselves, some of these tribes included the Huron, Ottawa, Chippewa, and Assiniboine. The Menominee, who inhabited the south shore of Lake Superior on what is today the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, also spoke Algonquin. But most of the tribes that lived on the south shores of the Great Lakes spoke the Iroquois language. They included the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and the Erie. The Tobacco tribe, also known as the Neutrals, lived between the Iroquois and the Algonquins, and out of necessity, they spoke both languages. There was one other language spoken around the Great Lakes. The tongue of the Lakota, or Sioux tribes, was spoken along the western shore of Lake Michigan by the Winnebagos, Fox Sauk, Miami, and Santee Dakotas. Virtually all the tribes on the northern side of the Great Lakes spoke the Algonquin language. The northernmost of these tribes were the Chippewa and the Ottawa. The Chippewa were primarily a hunting and gathering society, which means they killed animals for meat, caught fish, and gathered fruits, grains, and vegetables from the wild for their food. The short growing season of the north shore of the lakes made farming nearly impossible, but the Chippewa and Ottawa did perfect the art of harvesting wild rice. The Algonquin tribes lived in round lodges made of elm bark stretched over a pole frame. The western Chippewa, however, also lived in teepees made of hides. They learned how to make them from their Santee Dakota neighbors, whose territory spread out to the west of Lake Superior, where great herds of bison thrived. The farther south the territory, the more likely it was that the tribes could successfully grow corn and other crops. The Hurons, living at the south end of Lake Huron, mainly depended on traditional hunting and gathering, but they also raised small plots of corn. From their central position on the upper lakes, the Hurons were also a trading nation. They did much to promote the exchange of goods between the Chippewa and Dakota to the west, and the other Algonquin tribes to the east. Nearly all of the trade was conducted over water routes, and all of the tribes living around the Great Lakes used the same type of birch bark canoes. The strong but very light canoes were easy to carry or portage around the dangerous rapids found on many of the rivers and streams. The Iroquois were the mortal enemies of the Algonquin-speaking peoples. They lived mainly on the south shore of Lake Ontario and east into the present-day states of New York and Vermont. The Erie Indians, who lived along the south shore of Lake Erie, and the Tobacco tribe, which lived on the north shore of Lake Erie, also spoke the Iroquois language. The Iroquois language was quite different from Algonquin, and this inability of the two groups to communicate was much of the reason that a perpetual state of war existed between them. Although game was plentiful and fishing was easy, the Iroquois were mainly corn farmers and raised vast fields of the crop. The Iroquois protected their villages by building high stockades around them. Within the stockades, their dwellings were called longhouses. They were bark-covered, bent-pole structures that were long enough to house up to 5 families. The Iroquois family was matriarchal, which means the name and inheritance was passed down on the mother's side of the family. Iroquois power in the region rose to its height when the 5 main tribes agreed to stop fighting amongst themselves and joined together in an alliance. The Iroquois League of 5 Nations, as it was known, controlled the upper St. Lawrence River region and the lower 2 Great Lakes, Ontario and Erie. It was impossible to use the Niagara Falls portage between Lakes Erie and Ontario without the consent of the Iroquois. The state of war that existed for centuries between the Algonquin-speaking tribes and their Iroquois-speaking enemies was destined to have far-reaching effects with the arrival of the Europeans to the New World.
Most of the Great Lakes area was part of New France, or in French, Nouvelle France.
New France was the area colonized by France and North America during a period extending from the exploration of the St. Lawrence River by Jacques Cartier in 1534 to the cession of New France to Spain and Britain in 1763.
René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de la Salle, or Robert de la Salle, 1643 to 1687, was a French explorer. He explored the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada, the Mississippi River, and the Gulf of Mexico. La Salle claimed the entire Mississippi basin for France.
This is a map of La Salle's expeditions.
At its peak in 1712, the territory of New France extended from Newfoundland to the Rocky Mountains and from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico.
Much of the region of the Great American Waterways, including the Great Lakes area, together with the St. Lawrence Valley, the present-day American Midwest region, and the Mississippi River Valley down to New Orleans was once part of a huge region of New France.
The first Europeans to travel on the Great Lakes were French missionaries and explorers between the mid-1500s and mid-1600s,
such as Jacques Cartier, Etienne Bralé, Samuel de Champlain.
Horizontal ellipsis, René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de la Salle, and Jean Nicolet. Their travels opened up the fur trade, which exploited the lakes as a transport route to carry pelts by canoe from the interior to Atlantic ports.
This is a map of North America in 1681.
This is a 1688 map of western New France. It is the first printed map to show the Great Lakes in their entirety and the most accurate general portrayal of the lakes and tributaries in the 17th century.
This is New France, circa 1750, with the provinces of Lower Louisiana, Upper Louisiana, Upper Country of Louisiana, Canada, and Acadia.
This is New France at its apogee, about 1750.
This is New France circa 1750, showing also the areas under Spanish and British control.
This is the northern part of New France. As early as the 1620s, the French exerted control to the western margins of Lake Superior, establishing a fort at Detroit and tapping fur resources from Quebec in the east to western Ontario and Minnesota in the west.
This is the southern part of New France.
The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Canada, particularly in Quebec as the War of the Conquest, was a war fought in North America between France and Britain in the period 1754 and 1763. It was part of a larger worldwide conflict known as the 7 Years' War.
The name French and Indian War refers to the two main enemies of the British, the Royal French forces and the various American Indian forces allied with them. This conflict was the fourth colonial war between France and Britain, and resulted in the British conquest of Canada.
The outcome was one of the most significant developments in a century of Anglo-French conflict. To compensate its ally, Spain, for its loss of Florida, France ceded its control of French Louisiana west of the Mississippi.
France's colonial presence north of the Caribbean was reduced to the tiny islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon.
Both New France and New England wanted to expand their territories with respect to fur trading and other pursuits that matched their economic interests.
Using trading posts and forts, both the British and the French claimed the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, known as the Ohio Country.
English claims resulted from royal grants which had no definite western boundaries. The French claims resulted from La Salle's claim of the Mississippi River basin for France. Its drainage area includes the Ohio River Valley.
In order to secure these claims, both European powers took advantage of Native American factions to protect their territories and to keep the other from growing too strong.
The English colonists also feared papal influence in North America as New France was administered by French governors and Roman Catholic hierarchy, and missionaries such as Armand de la Richardie were active during this period.
For the predominantly Protestant British settlers, French control over North America could have represented a threat to their religious and other freedoms provided by English law. Likewise, the French feared the anti-Catholicism prevalent among English colonists in this period. Catholicism was still enduring persecution under English law.
We will next a movie on the French and Indian War.
The publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette has a vision of North America's future. One language, one religion, one nation, English and Protestant. There are 1 million people in the American colonies, and Benjamin Franklin is convinced they will grow to dominate the continent. Thousands of settlers are streaming into the richest part of the interior, the Ohio Valley. Anger is spreading among the Indian nations.
We have great reason to believe you intend to drive us away and settle the country. Or else why do you come and fight in the land God has given us?
Their fears are well-founded. Benjamin Franklin's press is fueling the urge for expansion into the Ohio Valley. Everyone wants part of it. But in the summer of 1755, the American push is crushed by the Indians and the French. Benjamin Franklin sees no future for English America unless the French are eliminated.
The French will set the Indians to harass our frontiers, kill and scalp our people, and drive in the advanced settlers. And so, preventing our obtaining more subsistence by cultivating new lands, they discourage our marriages and keep our people from increasing. Thus, if the expression may be allowed, killing thousands of our children before they are born.
Franklin declares that the French must be driven out. Now.
The safety and security of all the English colonies in North America, that is, their very being as colonies, make such measure absolutely necessary, and that without any loss of time.
The first victims are not even in Canada, but a peaceful population of French-speaking Acadians in Nova Scotia. The American colonists burn their settlements and ship thousands into exile. The battle for the continent has begun. Acadia is burning. The Ohio Valley is a killing ground. But a greater war is brewing across the ocean. A war that will consume empires. A war that will settle the fate of North America. Quebec is now a wartime city. Its streets overflow with French soldiers, Acadian refugees, and native warriors.
The Battle of the Plains of Abraham, also known as the Battle of Quebec, was a pivotal battle in 1759 in the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War. It was fought between the British and French on a plateau just outside the walls of Quebec City.
The battle involved fewer than 10,000 troops between both sides, but proved to be a deciding moment in the conflict over the fate of New France and creation of Canada.
At the end of the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, in 1763, New France east of the Mississippi River was ceded to Britain.
The war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This shows the British territorial gains following the Treaty of Paris in pink, and Spanish territorial gains after the Treaty of Fontainebleau in yellow.
The war changed economic, political, and social relations between Britain and its colonies. It plunged Britain into debt, which the Crown chose to pay off by increasing tax revenues from its colonies.
The British were also keen on keeping the peace in North America, especially on the colony's western frontiers. So in an effort to appease the various Indian tribes, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 included provisions prohibiting colonists from engaging in further expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains.
In taking these measures, the British government failed to appreciate that by eliminating the French threat in North America, the British had removed one of the strongest incentives the colonies had for retaining their links with Great Britain. Unpopular taxes, restrictions on colonial expansion, and concessions given to Quebec's Catholic population all contributed to the beginning of the American Revolutionary War.
The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by King George III following Great Britain's acquisition of French territory in North America after the end of the French and Indian War.
The purpose of the proclamation was to organize Great Britain's new North American empire and to stabilize relations with native North Americans through regulation of trade, settlement, and land purchases on the western frontier.
Table of Contents: The Great Lakes.
Thanks for watching. Please watch some more of my great videos.